Welcome back to Fossil versus Future. We've decided to do a What About Populism Part 2 after some recent news after our previous recording.
Yes, two things really, but mostly the second. The first is that since our recording, we had an example of a very significant shift in politics in the UK in local elections where the Reform Party, I think properly called a populist party, with a very strong anti-net zero, anti-environment, anti-action on climate change agenda, had huge success. It was proper to acknowledge that that had happened and to deal with the consequences for our intergenerational conversation on climate change. But the real trigger for this what about, because it is now a live what about, right? It features in conversations, right? I'm sure you've had them. I certainly have, which is what about Tony Blair's intervention in this debate? And we should say what that is.
Yeah, shall I give a...
Yeah, go ahead, just say.
Notably, the day before the local elections you just mentioned, the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change published a paper called The Climate Paradox: Why We Need to Reset Action on Climate Change. And in this paper, Tony Blair highlights that any strategy based on either phasing out fossil fuels in the short term or limiting consumption is a strategy doomed to fail. He notes that the debate over climate change has become irrational and that politicians are nervous to admit this for fear of being labelled climate deniers. He advocates for a new strategy centred on technological solutions, namely CCS or carbon capture and storage. I think those are some of the key things.
Those are the key things. So let's as we did in our programme, in our episode, let's acknowledge that a reset, a reframe, a rethink,
totally,
we agreed, right, was necessary.
That was one of our conclusions.
Okay. So on that, we agree, T. Blair. I should say, just by way of personal, I don't really know Tony Blair very well. I knew a little a long time ago, and even his elder brother was my pupil master in Chambers, and Cherie Blair was a very brief colleague of mine too. I feel like I've got a sort of generational connection with him, and that's partly why this really annoyed me, this intervention. The reset is understood. To have his voice in favour of a reset, I'm fine with. And then to go through what that means, I'm also fine with. The things that he's suggesting that we need to do and the language he used and the timing of the intervention, I'm not fine with. It was obvious, and it should have been obvious to a very skilled political operator, very experienced, a highly gifted politician like Tony Blair, that coming out with the announcement at that time would have been picked up by all of those publications, media outlets of one kind or another, and the social media players as very much in favour of the anti-net zero, let's not do the things that this government and indeed the previous governments advocated on the delivery of net zero. A very obvious break, a political break, and some language which could be used to reach into the vital middle ground that, generally speaking, the populists don't reach, but the populists plus Tony Blair can reach. So that the politics of it must have been deliberate, and to what end, I don't know.
I was going to ask, no.
Yeah. But then you get to the substance. Now, here's the thing that I understand also, that the substance, I don't want to get too technical about my objections, because it was an overtly political intervention. But he used his institution and has a big report, and the report is full of things that are just upside down.
Very confused.
Really confused, totally contradictory. So let's just deal with a few of them, right? First of all, the kind of celebration of carbon capture and storage and some of the other more expensive, less economically viable responses to climate change. In Climate Change Capital Days, a long time ago, 2002, 2003, we were working on those things. We were very happy to take instructions to help price carbon sequestered in in strata in the North Sea, or actually one of the big projects we did was in Canada. Right? This is not a new thing. This is not a great invention. There's no great insight coming from T. Blair on this topic. But what anybody who's worked on this will tell you is that it's very expensive. The price for carbon currently doesn't get it done. The early experiments have been slow. The fossil fuel industry likes it because it's very similar to what they already do. It's putting back what they already take out. They have the technology there. But it's not in any way a substitute for what is already economically viable in the alternatives to fossil fuels. So I just don't get this. At one level, we should focus on technology. Yeah, I'm 100% with you. Mm-hmm. And it's optimistic and it's positive. Again, we've talked about this before. There's a good pro-technology, pro-economic development agenda out there in the net zero. But he's spent no time on that, and he's gone straight to the most expensive, the most in need of subsidy, and the one that is favoured by the fossil fuel industry. Can't see any sense in that.
He has got some connections to the fossil fuels industry.
I suppose if you hang out with, oligarchs in the industry for long enough, you pick up their point of view. And actually, that's a serious point. If you spend your every day figuring out how to solve the climate change problem, where the technology is, where the solutions might lie, if you're really, really trying, you do not have this attitude. You do not think that fossil fuels will be inevitable forever, which is my next point. The assumption particularly in his commentary, in his foreword, is that it's unrealistic, is the phrase, unrealistic to contemplate declining demand for fossil fuels, as if you'd have to kind of mandate it in a very obvious way. Well, can we please pay attention to facts, to evidence?
The science,
Well, the science on the one hand, but which we should return to, but what's actually happening to demand in fossil fuels, that would be good. Where's the reference to the decline in demand in China? Where's the reference to the alternatives in electric vehicles, for example, not requiring fossil fuels to motor? No acknowledgement that what is actually happening right now, and there's plenty of evidence to look at, and if you're a research institution, you should know it, demand for fossil fuels, liquid fuels, for transportation in the largest economy in the world at the moment, China, is going down. Why? Because over 50% of the new vehicles bought this year were electric. And over a period of time, 5 years, 8 years, who knows, the whole fleet in China is going to shift towards electric vehicles. Buses, bikes, cars. Are you seriously suggesting that demand is going to continue to rise? It's not. It will fall, and it will not fall gently. When that happens, when the volume of electric vehicles gets up above a certain level, who knows exactly what, but a threshold will be reached, demand for liquid fuels will decline rapidly. So don't you dare use the word realist if you can't face up to reality. And that is the same with the science. What the hell is realistic about ignoring the effect of continuing down the same track on the real world fact of climate change? Where's that realistic? It's the absolute opposite. It's a fantasy that you can carry on for some unlimited period of time, because he doesn't want to fix a date, with the very things that are causing the harm that pick up cost and damage to the whole of humanity. That's not realism. That's defeatism. That's lack of will. That's lack of focus. And then you get to some of the other elements of the wish list and realize that in almost every instance, it's either already happening. Of course, we're investing in technology. Of course we are, massively, and we should do more. But those innovations, what will they do? They'll reduce demand for fossil fuels, because that's what they are. They're all about substitution, right? We still use fossil fuels, a lot of them, for plastics. We have had that conversation here, all right? There's a load of effort on the innovation side, trying desperately to think of what alternatives there might be, right? That's innovation. But what does it do? It's designed expressly to reduce demand. And the things that we now know reduce demand, far from creating a burden on the population as a whole, produce real benefits in cleaner air or in the technologies that are easy to use and produce. I mean, I don't know whether anyone seriously thinks that a green building is some kind of punishment or driving the latest electric vehicle is somehow a retrograde step. These are superior technologies. They're life-enhancing. They're improving. And then the final one, which I do think is really problematic for political parties that are trying to reach constituents with sometimes language which is alienating. I do get that. We talked about that. One of the key forms of language that's had real effect in our political world in the last few years is control, right? Take back control. These technologies that we're talking about give you more control, not less.
Very
right?
true.
So if you use light to make electrons and you can store electrons in your home or in your car and it's usable directly and it's in your community, you've got more control over a vital part of your existence, energy, than if you're dependent on a supply chain and Russian gas. You've got more control, not less. If Tony Blair had said, we need to reset, we've got to change our language, we've got to reach people who aren't convinced about some of these arguments before, and the technical language is alienating them. But what we really mean is to give people more control over their lives, more resilience, live better as a result. Okay, hallelujah, thank you, Tony, you're a great communicator. But they didn't do that.
Talked about the sacrifices people are having to make and not seeing the results. And
that's just nonsense. This is just nonsense. And so I'm thinking, what do you do about that? I'm not a hands-on politician. But I would help any politician of any party reach a constituent that didn't think climate change was relevant to them, make the case of why it is. All the choices that get made every day. So if someone comes into your surgery in your constituency up in, pick a part of the country that maybe he was thinking about, right? And says, we just haven't got enough housing. I can't get a place. I can't afford a place here. Okay, so let's have a conversation about housing. Well, there are choices you can make about what sort of housing. Where is it going to be? Is it going to be in a flood zone? No. Where is it going to be? What's the infrastructure for it? Is it going to be well insulated? Could you use the roof to generate power? Could you store power? Could you build a community energy system that allowed you to connect an electric vehicle with storage to the house and to whatever you're generating either on the house or in the community? Can you do that? That would give a community more control and lower costs and cleaner air and a better life. Each and every one of these political choices that has to be made, maybe particularly in communities that might feel themselves vulnerable or at risk from change, no matter what party you belong to, you should be able to make the connection between those choices and this, that, or the other is better for responding to climate change, either increasing your resilience or providing some way of reducing emissions, making some contribution from your place to the problem being solved. That's the kind of intervention you'd want to have from a major political figure like Tony Blair. And we didn't get it. And it's if I ever got the chance, I would tell it to him very directly. This will do for now.
And the global impact would be interesting because the UK is really seen as a leader in net zero, and the UK starts being less strong on net zero or starting to go back on policies. And I think that could be quite damaging globally. I think it could take away courage from other countries to step forward and advance their net zero agendas.
I think that's right. And again, your generation, at least, he's still a relevant figure. But I wonder, I might just ask you by way of concluding here, how relevant now? I mean, could it be argued that that's the sort of intervention of a has-been politician, of a past politician? I mean, what do you think?
I think there are younger generations than me, perhaps, that would say he wasn't so relevant. But I remember, going on certain anti-war marches when I was younger.
Right.
Still very much a familiar name. I think for me, it was the timing and the impact that it potentially has on politics and this shift towards populism that we're seeing. And that aspect, I think, is more scary for me, I think. And the fact that people will stand behind what he's saying wherever they are in the country because he has that reputation, and it might move people away from agreeing with the climate change agenda.
Gives them a reason to...
Yeah. Exactly.
Let go of that one
doubt.
or to doubt. To doubt, at the very least.
Yeah. Yeah, it was funny because reading it through, there are so many of our whatabouts.
Yeah. It's like a collection of them, wasn't it?
It was almost as if you could tick them off. It was, what about China?
Oh, yeah, we had that one too. I mean,
how about how
kidding?
the developing world are going to be the problem on climate change, and namely China and India? And have you read anything about what China's doing?
Do you know what's going on? Have you looked at India's solar program? I mean, what on earth are you on? What is this about?
Yeah.
The single biggest change in economic development is visible in China right now in the electrification of the economy. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously not a pure picture. There's still massive investment in coal. There's still coal-fired power stations. There's still an awful lot of fossil in view. But if you can't notice the sheer size of the renewables sector, the fact that China, as we've said in our programs, are the number one producer of the whole long list of solutions because they've invested in it over the last decade. If you can't see that, why are you contributing? What's the value of your contribution other than to serve all of those whatabouts? Because they're all answerable in some sensible, rational way, even before you get to the timing of the intervention, which is clearly a political intervention. I wonder whether or not, I've slightly sort of gabbled on a bit here, but I'm not a political advisor, right? So I don't know whether there's any value in what I'm thinking at the moment, but I'm rather hoping that this intervention, which I think is cack-handed and poor, might stimulate the government and the others who want to see real action, real political action on climate change, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, sections of the Conservative Party that were kind of the blue, green, the turquoises, might allow them to find the courage to step up and do the reset themselves, to say, no, Tony Blair intervened, he got it wrong, but he was right about the reset. So here's our version of it. Because at the moment what's happened is that he's been welcomed into the club by all those in the opposition who have an anti-net zero or go carefully, go cautious. And maybe that's the final point, which we did talk about in our meeting. One of the things that we have learned to date, partly from the Chinese experience, but partly from things that we've done ourselves, is that the greater macroeconomic gain comes from real commitment to go faster, not slower.
Yeah. The longer we delay, the more expensive these things are going to be and the more damage we're going to see.
Yeah, and the slower the learning into what the solutions are and what cost. So we'll get to the cost reduction for the ordinary consumer quicker by being 100% dedicated to the transition as opposed to being equivocal.
We need to make that clearer somehow.
And
the other one that was in there, James, was what about COP?
I know.
There was an attack of the COP process in there as well.
There was, but then in amongst the celebration of the absolute need to do international cooperation. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. But how exactly? So one of the things that was hinted at in his, but not fully developed, is, well, we can do major economies, which he's thinking of something that happened during his time. There was a smaller subset of countries that got together.
About climate?
About climate, yeah.
Okay.
The reason why it didn't last is it requires real political commitment to make it last, and that fluctuated with US involvement up and down. Right? But also because the multilateral process, including all countries, that meets every year, is the one that includes all those countries that are most vulnerable. If you cut them out of the conversation, it's clearly wrong. So there can't be an either-or. You have to persevere with the multilateral process. That's everybody in. But you can't depend upon it. We now know that the system is really slow. It's not an either-or. You have the multilateral process all-inclusive, but then you break bits off where you can get more done faster with the power that you have to solve some section of the problem. Maybe it's in a sector, or it's a smaller group of countries that can enforce standards that are harmonized, things like that. That's all fine. But this intervention adds nothing. What he's saying is that, the multilateral process is slow and unwieldy. We know that, right? But international cooperation is necessary. We know that too. What's your solution? Nothing appears. So thanks, but do some more work next time.
And it's quite a familiar strategy that we see with these right-wing populist parties, where they talk really strongly about these certain messages and ideas, but then when you're actually trying to find out, like, what are the solutions that you're suggesting here, it's not clear.
You're absolutely right. It's very frustrating doing multilateral negotiations. But if you reckon the problem can only be solved by multilateral cooperation, what's your better offer? There will be alternatives that will work, but they need real commitment and resources, dedication, probably, ghastly thought, staff, people who work on it full time. And we're entering an age where there seems to be no political will in the major economies to do any of that. So again, if you're going to make an intervention with your very big name, please think about what the answer is. And don't pretend that there haven't been thousands of people thinking about this for the last 30-something years of COP negotiations.
I'd love to know how they feel about the response to this.
I hope they're feeling pretty embarrassed at the quality of the work.
They did come out with a correction the following day or a couple of days later.
I'm sympathetic to the commentary on commentary on commentary. After a while, the way the papers spin the report starts to get further and further away from what they actually said. I'm sympathetic with that, but nonetheless, you compare the technical analysis in the Energy Transition Commission with that. I mean, it's like different grades of work.
Thank you so much for listening to Fossil versus Future. Please subscribe to our podcast and give us a rating. And please follow us on social media. Let us know the questions that you want answers to or that you'd like us to discuss.